Tunis, January the 14th, 2011. Outside the Interior Ministry, which also serves as a torture complex, tens of thousands of Tunisians demand the departure of President Ben Ali. Look. Here, here, and here. Protesters have climbed to high vantage points. A way of estimating the force of the movement, of observing it, of counting numbers. The success of the mobilization signifies to everybody that the fall of the regime has become a serious possibility. But the feeling of power can almost make one forget just how volatile the situation really is, and that the authorities are still fighting for their lives. The revolt enters a new phase where the question of seizing power is raised. It's now a fight to the death, during which the powers that be will resort to any kinds of means not to capitulate. Paris, May 1968. Faced with the student uprising, which began in the Latin Quarter on May the 3rd, the government had made several attempts to suppress it and to also make concessions. But it had been unable to prevent revolt from spreading to the factories. France was now in the grip of the biggest general strike in its history. For more than 20 days, the country had entered a crisis to which no one could see a way out. On May the 21st, student leader Daniel Cohn-Bendit, completely fazed by the extent of the movement, took advantage of an invitation from the University of Berlin to leave France for a while. But on his return to Paris, the government had already taken its decision on how to deal with him. May the 24th, the border between France and Germany.
Près de 500 étudiants allemands et français attendaient Daniel Cohn-Bendit à la frontière. Le leader du mouvement du 22 mars refusait de signer son arrêté d'interdiction de séjour. Ce n'est pas mon expulsion qui réglera les problèmes de la France. Je reviendrai, dit-il, avant d'être reconduit vers l'Allemagne.
The student uprising had suddenly lost its emblematic figure. But with or without Cohn-Bendit, the student leaders remained incapable of imposing their own end on the revolt.
We knew we couldn't win. We were just a small group. We had managed to start a mass uprising and partly structure it, but we knew that alone we couldn't beat the government. We weren't a political party. We had no serious footholds in power. We had no members of parliament.
That same day, President Charles de Gaulle proposed a referendum, but the proposition would unleash the worst night of violence since the start of the uprising. Another attempt to find a solution had collapsed.
Cette nuit folle devait faire plus de 400 blessés parmi les manifestants et 150 du côté des forces de police.
The next day, May the 25th, it was Prime Minister Georges Pompidou's turn to look for an answer.
Pompidou's idea was to let the movement run its course and die out once it saw it was heading into a dead end and not offering any solutions. But that also supposed a second thing: the need to elicit the cooperation of all those who were afraid of disorder, namely the trade unions.
When it came to finding a solution in face of the government, even if it meant eventually replacing it, the Communist Party and the CGT trade union would be the defining forces.
As an emergency measure, Pompidou summoned the unions to the Ministry of Labour. De Gaulle's government had decided to find an answer with its main adversaries, the CGT and the Communist Party, then the second largest party in France, representing a quarter of the electorate.
Talks finished on the morning of Monday, May the 27th, which meant we'd spent 2 nights negotiating.
We were prepared to strike a deal, only if the government and bosses made concessions. And they did. A lot of them.
Georges Séguy could be satisfied. In the early hours of May the 27th, the unions, led by the CGT, left the talks as the big winners. In a few hours, the bosses agreed to over 20 years of demands, enough to put an end to the strikes.
Alors, à votre avis, quand une possible reprise du travail?
À moins que l'on estime pouvoir aller plus loin, à ce moment, la reprise du travail ne saurait tarder.
Je vous remercie.
There was still one matter to be dealt with. The Grenelle Accords wouldn't be definitely signed until they were accepted by the workers. Séguy heralded immediately to the CGT's bastion, the Renault factory in Billancourt. If the workers there accepted the accord, it would lead others back to work. But Séguy was greeted with a white-hot atmosphere.
La parole à Georges Séguy, secrétaire général de la CGT.
Ne nous méprenons pas, camarades. Rien n'est signé.
Séguy immediately felt that his proposal wouldn't be accepted, and the CGT leader couldn't afford to lose face in this working-class fortress.
Car le gouvernement, il ne saurait être question que nous signions.
La grève est poursuivie à l'unanimité.
Et donc,
So we realized it had been rejected. I called Pompidou, whom I had to wake up. It was about 10 in the morning and he'd only gone to bed at 8 or 9. I said, look, it hasn't worked. He said, good luck then, and hung up. They were 2 very tough days because everything was going to collapse this time.
In 4 days, the solutions offered by the President and the Prime Minister all failed, leaving the powers with no other options to solve the crisis, as millions of striking workers decided to continue their movement until the fall of the regime. Beijing, May the 17th, 1989. 1 million people now occupy Tiananmen Square in support of a few thousand students who've begun a hunger strike with the aim of forcing the government into talks. Since Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev arrived for an official visit, the world's eyes have been fixed on China. On the square, Wu Kaishi and the other student leaders are finding it harder and harder to control the situation.
I think we were doing our best with a student movement of such size. We weren't disciplined like an army, and we weren't a totally united movement with a single hierarchy.
During the first stage, we would lead the students onto the streets. And I knew that after we would lead them back to the campuses. I knew that for sure. But once we'd occupied Tiananmen Square, we began a hunger strike. We presented our demands, but still had no reply from the government. I had absolutely no idea how things were going to turn out.
Zhao Ziyang's political line seemed to differ from that of the government. So we became aware that there were divergences amongst the powers that be.
The Chinese leaders totally disagreed on how to bring the uprising to an end. On one side were Prime Minister Li Peng and Deng Xiaoping, head of the military commission, who both wanted to declare martial law. On the other was Zhao Ziyang, General Secretary of the party, who favoured dialogue. On May the 18th, 1989 at 5 a.m., Zhao Ziyang, closely shadowed by Li Peng, visited the hunger-striking students in hospital. During his visit, he declared, "Your enthusiasm for democracy, a lawful state, and the fight against corruption is very praiseworthy. But I beg you to stop your hunger strike." A few hours later, Gorbachev left China. Events would now speed up. The next day, May the 19th, at 4 in the morning, Zhao Ziyang, again accompanied by Li Peng, paid his first visit to Tiananmen Square. As he spoke, he seemed particularly unsettled.
Zhao Ziyang came to Tiananmen Square and he said, "We've come too late. Much too late." What I felt when I heard that was great surprise. Why had they come too late? And why did he add, "much too late"? What did it mean? Was our moment in history already over?
At 8 o'clock that evening, the occupiers of Tiananmen Square were distraught to learn that Zhao Ziyang had been ousted from power.
When I heard about what Zhao Ziyang had said, and that he'd been evicted from power, I started to feel worried, because we knew that Zhao Ziyang was more or less on our side. To be honest, I started getting scared. Not for my personal situation, being arrested or being expelled from university. I wasn't scared of that. I was scared because I didn't know what the outcome of the uprising would be.
Soon after the eviction of Zhao Ziyang, rumors of an imminent declaration of martial law began to spread through Tiananmen Square. In shock, the students stopped their hunger strike. After defeating the camp that advocated dialogue, the Chinese government had seemingly opted for a military solution to maintain power. On the square, incredulity and anxiety grew as everyone expected an impending army intervention. Norfle-le-Château near Paris, October the 6th, 1978. Ayatollah Khomeini, the charismatic figure of the Iranian Revolution for a year now, has been expelled from Iraq under pressure from the Shah and is continuing to live in exile in France.
Khomeini did not want to go to a non-Muslim country, especially non-Shiite. In his mind, he was merely stopping over in Paris, and no more than that.
But something would happen while Khomeini was in Paris that he hadn't foreseen.
In Paris, over 400 articles and interviews concerning Khomeini were published in France's biggest newspapers. And he was all over the biggest international news services. The BBC World Service, broadcast in Persian, became a media platform par excellence for Khomeini and his entourage.
The moment Khomeini moved to Norfle-le-Château and addressed the Iranian population with his main message, "The Shah must go," it was as if a divine message had come from heaven for the Iranian people via a cleric. This message established Khomeini not only as the religious leader, as the main Ayatollah, but also as a political leader.
Meanwhile, in Tehran, martial law had been in operation for a month.
Despite martial law, protests carried on every day. Every day there were clashes, every day there were injuries, and every couple of days there were 2, 3, 4, 6 people killed.
While demonstrations regularly turned into riots, Iranian soldiers began to disagree with the methods being employed, and cases of desertion increased. The revolt had now affected the army, which risked breaking into rival factions.
And that was when divisions appeared in the army, and there was a succession of breakouts from the barracks, even shootings. There were even shootings inside the Lavizan barracks in the north of Tehran. Everyone expected a coup d'etat. Really, we were very scared.
On November the 6th, 1978, the Shah, under pressure from his generals, hardened his stone and appointed a military government.
A soldier was appointed head of government, but a soldier with a very liberal past. It was General Azari, who was more of an intellectual than a firm-handed soldier. The military government took over, and within a week things had quieted down. And on seeing that nothing was going on, the opposition started its protests again.
The movement further intensified from December 3rd, when the ritual processions of Muharram, the month of mourning in Shia Islam, turned into demonstrations involving millions of people. On December the 31st, less than 2 months after its appointment, the military government realized it was powerless and resigned. During that Shiite month of mourning, the charisma of the exiled Khomeini took on a monumental dimension. As for the regime, it gave the impression of having tried everything. And after the resignation of the military government, its options appeared limited. Poland, spring 1981. In 6 months, Solidarity, the first free trade union in East Europe, has become a genuine opposition and has extended its influence throughout Polish society. But the impression of power that the movement gives must never forget the sword of Damocles hanging over its head.
We were all wondering what the line was before the Soviet Union decided to intervene. That was our big problem.
Self-limitation, the movement's survival strategy, was imposed in order to keep the revolt inside workplaces and to prevent unauthorized strikes and street clashes.
The success of the first strikes, I must admit, surprised many of the union leaders. Consequently, they thought we had the perfect solution. The moment there was a problem in a workplace or in a region, they could call a strike to put pressure on the government.
We'll call our own strike, we'll hold our own demonstration, and we'll apply our own policies. Once that happened, the national union leadership totally lost control. The situation became a political impasse, but it was a very strong social phenomenon. And the hardest conflicts to resolve were, in fact, conflicts of this nature.
So we had to go to workplaces to convince people to stop striking.
The leaders of Solidarity were forced to cover the whole country in order to keep control of the movement. On March the 19th, 1981, 200 policemen viciously beat up Solidarity activists who'd occupied the council chamber of the city of Bydgoszcz while petitioning for the recognition of the Free Union. For the millions of members and 30,000 executives of Solidarity, this was a step too far. Many of them now stated their readiness to fight on the streets and in the workplace if necessary. In an attempt to calm things, the Solidarity leaders called a 1-hour strike. But for the first time, it was unable to stop things spitting out onto the streets.
Żebyśmy blokowali. Mamy dyscyplinę zachować.
Proszę się cofnąć.
No właśnie, ale doprowadziliśmy do tego, że na nas gwiżdżą, no. Gdybyśmy byli spokojni.
Grassroots Solidarity members were intent on taking Poland into a general strike, both an unprecedented and very worrying action.
Wałęsa
Walesa had union advisors, church advisors, and lay intellectual advisors. And all of them, and that included me, were terrified that things would turn sour and lead to a Soviet invasion.
Walesa and the other Solidarity leaders had good reasons to be afraid, because the Soviet army, on training exercises close to the Polish border, decided to stay for an undetermined time. The message was categorical. A general strike by Polish workers would result in a military intervention.
We were so close to victory that we were also very close to falling into the abyss. Myths about heroic people are great in mythology, but in real life, people have to live, raise their children, go to work, make a living, etc. And these people had it in their minds that they were soldiers heading into mortal combat.
To prevent a massacre, Walesa decided to trample on all the sacred rules in place within the trade union movement. He decided to negotiate alone with the government and single-handedly suspended all kinds of strikes until the next Polish Communist Party Congress.
When Walesa declared there would be no combat, the other union leaders were furious, absolutely furious.
That created divisions within the union leadership, and those divisions lasted and were never resolved.
In July 1981, the Polish Communist Party Congress was held in a mood that would have made Lenin turn in his grave. Usually, votes were taken by show of hand and carried unanimously. Usually, the elected were known in advance. But the party, spiriting out of control, decided on secret ballots. It ousted 90% of the incumbent Central Committee, the governing body. Opinions were voiced, radically opposed stances taken. A third of Polish Communist Party members had also become members of Solidarity.
It was the most striking example of how the party leadership could no longer trust its own members.
After the breakup within the Polish Communist Party, the government seemed powerless. All eyes were now on Solidarity, as its leaders fought tooth and nail to control its troops in order to prevent a bloody outcome. Tunisia, January the 14th, 2011. After 4 weeks of violently suppressed protests, and despite the concession agreed to by the dictator Ben Ali, the revolt has reached the capital, Tunis. Protesters have assembled outside the Interior Ministry. But here, action will go far beyond anything witnessed on Avenue Bourguiba. Sporadic riots break out in several districts of Tunis, which start to have Ben Ali and his entourage worried.
Around 11 a.m., Ben Ali ordered General Seriati to get the presidential plane ready to take Layla Ben Ali and their son to Saudi Arabia.
General Ali Seriati was the head of security for the president and his family. In Ben Ali's name, he had supreme control of the army and all of the police services. He gave the order to prepare the presidential plane, which would take off from the military airport. In all urgency, Layla Ben Ali demanded that her family, the Trablesies, flee the country as quickly as possible. Thought of as parvenus who'd helped themselves to much of the contents of Tunisia's coffers, the Trablesies hastily packed up and left to Tunis civil airport. 4 hours later, at 3 p.m., the protest outside the Interior Ministry was viciously dispersed. It was then that General Seriati heard the unlikeliest of news.
The Trabelsi family, who were at the airport at that moment because they were trying to flee, were arrested on the personal initiative of a BAT commander.
Seriati soon discovered that the BAT commander had acted on his own initiative and that the security forces were beginning to divide. He decided to conceal the information from Ben Ali and to immediately solve the problem himself. But he was faced with a second unforeseen event. Of the 70 men in the Presidential Guard, 50 of them refused to enter into a fight with the BAT. Seriati now realized he could no longer count on his own men.
Seriati decided to try to find a way to get Ben Ali to leave on the plane with the First Lady. He had to get Ben Ali out at any price.
At the military airport, to convince Ben Ali to temporarily leave the country until things were back in order, General Seriati revealed at the last moment that the Trabelsi family had been arrested and that he was no longer able to ensure his safety.
A little before 6 p.m., the situation changed dramatically. Ben Ali decided to leave on the plane with his family to make sure they arrived safely in Saudi Arabia and then return later that evening.
News of Ben Ali's departure reached the Ministry of Defense, which had lost all confidence in General Seriati and feared a coup d'etat.
The army intervened by arresting General Seriati on the spot.
Meanwhile, at the civil airport, the BAT, joined by a special unit of the National Guard, organized the transfer of the Trabelsi family. One of the members of the two crack teams would film the scene with a cell phone. Watch closely what he does. By filming the two badges, that of the National Guard and that of the BAT, he ensures there's proof that the two brigades were involved in the arrest of the dictator's family-in-law. The BAT and the National Guard would then hand the Trabelsis over to the army, itself responsible for the arrest of General Seriati. At 6:30 p.m., after the curfew was applied, protesters were still trying to get home.
People were calling us saying, don't take this exit, don't take that exit, they're waiting for you. And we thought, if Ben Ali doesn't leave today, we're all done for. And at one point, a man came out of his home in his underwear. It was after dark and just amazing. He came out shouting, Ben Ali has gone. I thought to myself, we've all gone crazy. Look at this poor guy, because the scenario was unimaginable.
At 7 p.m., Prime Minister Mohammed Ghanouchi, flanked by the presidents of the two assemblies, officially announced on TV the departure of Ben Ali.
لأحكام الفصل 56 من الدستور الذي ينص على أنه في صورة تعذر على رئيس الجمهورية القيام بمهامه بصفة وقتية أن يفوض سلطاته إلى الوزير الأول.
People didn't stop being afraid of Ben Ali because he'd fled. They had a mixture of totally incompatible emotions, both joy and fear. We all went a little crazy. Everyone, with no exceptions. We were a country of 12 million citizens who didn't have a clue what was going on. I still couldn't believe it. It came as a total shock. But since there was a curfew in place, we couldn't even go out to celebrate Ben Ali's departure. And we immediately entered a stage, not of chaos, but of total confusion and extreme fear.
In the space of 10 hours, under pressure from the street, certain brigades of the security forces took matters into their own hands, precipitating the flight of Ben Ali. But the sudden void paradoxically plunged Tunisia into a state of uncertainty, especially as shots began to ring out in Tunis. Beyond a certain threshold, revolt makes a situation both volatile and unpredictable, while society lives through moments of madness mixed with euphoria and anxiety. As the possible solutions begin to collapse one after the other, alliances are formed and broken amid urgency and distrust. And while power divides or totally crumbles, competition between the different players to come out on top reaches a new level of intensity. Paris, May the 27th, 1968. On the very same day as the failure of the Grenelle Accord between the government and the communists, some believed that the question of power was now settled. Two non-communist left-wing leaders, François Mitterrand and Pierre Mendès France, formed an alliance and put themselves forward as an alternative to the ailing government.
And it was at that point that political ambitions and ulterior motives appeared among the left wing. Basically, there was deep disagreement amongst all of them. The Communist Party distrusted the Socialist Party, Mendès France distrusted Mitterrand, Mitterrand distrusted Mendès France.
That's when we found out no one wanted us. They wanted a solution without us, or even one that went against us. That was at the rally at the Charletti Stadium. We spent the whole night debating whether we should go or not. What was the point of it? And finally, late into the night, our policy bureau sent out a communiqué saying, "Don't attend, because they plan to keep the communists out of the solution."
The meeting on May the 27th at Charletti Stadium was mainly attended by joyous bands of left-wing students and the non-communist left wing. Mendès France waited in the wings, ready to take the mic. But when his name was mentioned by one speaker, whistles were heard from the crowd. Scared of being booed, Mendès France decided not to speak. The next day, May the 28th, François Mitterrand held a press conference. With no constitutional foundation, Mitterrand proposed to form a transitional government led by Mendès France, and to later hold presidential elections for which, of course, he would be a candidate.
Je vous annonce, parce que le terme éventuel est à 18 jours, et parce que c'est le même combat, je suis candidat.
This proposal merely added to the general confusion and increased panic amongst communist leaders.
He thought power, as we used to say back then, could be scraped up off the street. Well, no, it wasn't that simple.
Indeed, the reactions from the other pretenders and the chaos of the situation in France would spell immediate failure for Mitterrand and Mendès' proposal. Wednesday, May the 29th, President Charles de Gaulle, totally distraught and sleepless for several days, decided to cancel his cabinet meeting and take his private helicopter to his country home in Colombey to rest.
Early that afternoon, we heard that the general's helicopter had gone off radar. We didn't know where he was. He hadn't landed at Colombey. We didn't know what was going on. Staying alone in Paris when your head of state has disappeared and a communist march is planned for the afternoon was extremely disturbing.
The communists, as a riposte to Charletti, had organized a huge demonstration on that day. Everyone in France was now aware that the president had disappeared. And Prime Minister Pompidou feared that the communists would take advantage of the institutional void to wrest power.
We brought airborne troops closer to Paris, and we asked the Rambouillet tank regiment to carry out open maneuvers in the suburbs of Paris.
The news that tanks had been seen close to the capital created a wave of panic amongst the communist leaders.
Some of us went into hiding for 48 hours. The party needed to keep a backup of leaders so we wouldn't be caught short. After all, a putsch against us seemed possible, either from the government or from certain colonels and generals, going beyond even de Gaulle.
By the afternoon of May the 29th, every attempt to solve the crisis had failed. The head of state had mysteriously vanished. The government feared a communist coup d'etat, and the communists, fearing a military putsch, had gone underground. Beijing, May the 19th, 10 p.m.
如果再不迅速扭转局面，广大的革命的先烈用鲜血创造出来的中华人民共和国的前途和命运都面临着严重的危险。
Martial law had been declared. 22 divisions of the Chinese Red Army were already heading for Tiananmen Square, while on the square itself, Li Peng's speech, broadcast over loudspeakers, unleashed fear and anger. The hope of a peaceful solution had vanished.
Neither we nor the government had predicted that the people of Beijing would react so quickly. When the army arrived, people came out onto the streets and blocked the tanks.
The army began to experience internal problems. Some soldiers, such as this one, had crossed over to the side of the protesters.
We then asked the people to continue blocking the military convoys so that the army wouldn't reach the capital. In so doing, we hoped to force high-ranking officials to change their minds. We hoped that the government would abolish martial law.
On the morning of May the 20th, the army was still blocked in the suburbs of Beijing. As 8 generals of the Chinese Red Army sent a letter to Deng Xiaoping demanding the suspension of martial law, some divisions were sent in, totally unarmed. And General Xu Qinshan, commander of the 38th Army, openly refused to obey the orders of his superiors. At 5 p.m, helicopters dropped copies of the decree declaring martial law, when in reality, the military solution had already failed. Throughout China, protests broke out against martial law. The Chinese Red Army, charged with repressing the uprising, was falling apart. This totally unexpected success gave new vigor to the movement and radically changed the mood on Tiananmen Square. In a state of euphoria, the occupiers had new hope. But while martial law was still in place, nobody knew how the party would end. Iran, December 1978. The Shah, exhausted and stricken by cancer, could only think of leaving the country for treatment. And rumours about his forthcoming departure were already beginning to spread. After the failure of the military government and running out of solutions, he turned to the democratic opposition to try to form a new government. Only Shapur Bakhtiar, a former political prisoner and the leader of the National Front, a democratic party, accepted the post of prime minister.
When Shapur Bakhtiar accepted the Shah's offer, he was excluded from the National Front because the other members of the party would all rally behind Khomeini and his cause over the coming weeks. Shapur Bakhtiar was appointed because he was a reformist, but he needed time to calm down the political scene so there could be a referendum. A referendum to decide the nature and type of regime. He had nothing against switching to a republican regime. All he wanted was time.
The day after he was appointed Prime Minister, he was insulted and defamed during protests by the population. And suddenly, any attempt at reform or change within the regime was considered as a betrayal.
All of the Iranian intelligentsia, educated at the Sorbonne in Paris and the top American universities, all backed Khomeini, all of them.
Meanwhile, Khomeini, strengthened by the opposition against the Shah from all sides, remained evasive about the exact nature of the Islamic State he hoped to form.
Khomeini's inner circle, made up of Islamo-religious intellectuals, remained intentionally obscure about the future of this Islamic state. The term was already being mentioned in slogans: Islamic Republic, Islamic State, etc. But what did this jumble of terms really mean? Nobody knew. There was no written constitution, no debate, no communiques, nothing, absolutely nothing. All people knew was it was Islamic, and in that case, good.
On January the 16th, 1979, the Shah left Iran for Egypt after 35 years on the throne. Shapur Bakhtiar thought he could work with all parties and with Khomeini to ensure a transition to democracy. But the Shah's sudden departure exacerbated the competition for future power, and all the competing political groups, from the far left to the Islamists, joined in the joyful demonstrations that took place that day.
During these demonstrations, some of our friends within the security forces, which had been designated by the organizing committee, came to see me saying there were certain religious elements, wearing turbans, asking strange questions. I said, what, for example? They said, for example, why are men and women allowed to be together during this demonstration? Consequently, on the day the Shah departed, I already started feeling a certain anxiety about the future, because none of us knew what it would hold.
All that the Shah hadn't actually abdicated, his departure made Khomeini's return even more probable, as Prime Minister Shapur Bakhtiar would admit.
آیت الله خمینی هر وقت تشریف بیارن مقدمشون مبارک است. بنده گفتم حاضرم تضمین بکنم ورود ایشون را. وقتی هم آمدند اگر برنامه‌هایی دارند و ارائه میدند با کمال احترام ما گوش خواهیم داد. ولی اگر میخوان نخست وزیر بشن یا چیزی شبیه به این، بنده در جای خودم بسیار راحتم با تمام مشکلات.
But Bakhtiar stood alone against the massed ranks of Khomeini supporters. On January the 24th, 1979, the Immortals, the Shah's elite troops, took their own stands, and the message was clear.
All military units are to support the legal government. And as long as there is a legal government, there's nothing to worry about.
So the Prime Minister Bakhtiar has the total support of the army?
By command of His Majesty.
Although no one knew of his intentions, all eyes were on the enigmatic Khomeini. Iran was now gripped by uncertainty. Poland, September 1981. The Polish government and Communist Party were in such a sorry state that a section of Solidarity militants began asking the question about seizing power, which was in total contradiction with the self-limitation line still upheld by the National Union leaders.
The people's impatience was growing and growing, and thus becoming more dangerous.
We decided that the most crucial thing we needed to do was to hold a Solidarity Congress and establish a program.
The Congress was expected to be a great event, but the authorities were afraid of it. They were afraid of the outcome of that Congress.
We were more and more aware that we were facing a race against the clock. And that was particularly dramatic.
On September the 5th, 1981, when the first ever Solidarity Congress opened, every Pole was hoping for an outcome that would finally put an end to the chaos that had taken over the country. In the Gdansk multisport arena, 2,000 guests sit around the 900 delegates present. With their boos and cheers, they would swing the voting one way or another. And on September the 8th, the Congress veered totally by sending out an appeal for all East European peoples to form their own free trade unions.
The appeal to the other Eastern European nations, which later took on a very important role, was beyond all control.
This appeal freed the delegates of all inhibitions. From then on, political demands, something the leadership had always forbidden, were openly expressed.
More and more radical political ideas began to emerge. More and more groups with the idea of becoming political parties began to form. And there was a clear signal that there were a lot of people prepared to fight against the present powers in order to set up a new power.
Some even had the crazy idea of going behind the Polish Communist Party's back and dealing directly with Moscow.
There was no chance of finding a direct agreement with the Soviet leadership that would guarantee its own interests. But this type of debate, or rather discussion, was held by a number of people. However, we knew that it would end in civil war.
Even Lech Wałęsa's own authority was questioned. He was now faced with three rivals for the presidency of Solidarity.
The feeling of power, the need to succeed, and the need to maintain dynamism drove us onward, but onwards towards a confrontation that we had to win. But controlling this process, maybe controlling isn't the right word, influencing this process meant not overstepping certain limits. But that was becoming less and less possible.
All the tendencies within Solidarity, which went from the far left to the openly anti-Semitic far right, entered into a fierce battle. Everyone accused each other of betrayal, and all-round paranoia set in. Wałęsa was finally re-elected, but with only 55% of the votes, a big blow to him. On October the 7th, 1981, with no one understanding how it had come to pass, Solidarity suddenly had a revolutionary program with demands for a self-governing Polish Republic and free relation with the Soviet Union. Self-limitation, the founding strategy of the trade union, had just been blown to pieces. As Poland was paralyzed and Solidarity left its Congress in tatters, nobody could see another outcome other than revolution. Tunis, January the 15th, 2011. Shots continued ringing out through the night until dawn. But no one knew who was firing at whom. The capital was gripped with fear.
That was the toughest moment, because we didn't know what would happen to all of us. The security forces were no longer able to protect citizens because they were being targeted themselves. We had no idea who was responsible for the violence. We were living in uncertainty, doubt, and fear.
It was against this backdrop of chaos that Mohamed Ghannouchi, Ben Ali's former prime minister, formed a new government.
Mr. Ghannouchi formed a government on January the 17th, which included politicians from the opposition, but also a certain number of ministers who had served under Ben Ali.
It was blatantly clear that his sole idea was to prepare for the forthcoming presidential elections, which meant continuing with the same regime. It was outrageous that the guy who took power after Ben Ali was his right-hand man. It basically meant we were landed with exactly the same thing.
In this race for power, the next day, January the 18th, saw the first organised show of force by a group which until then had remained in the wings, the Islamists of the Ennahda party.
Everyone agreed, from left wing to right wing. Everyone rejected the idea that the RCD should be able to oversee the transition towards a new period. Everyone agreed that if we wanted something new, then we had to make a clean break with the past. After that came the first sit-in, the sit-in we called Casbah 1, because the Casbah was the seat of the government.
On January the 22nd, a week after the dictator's departure, the new government was booed on the streets. There was still a mood of urban warfare at night, while by day, protests continued to increase. Doubts began to rise over the intentions of the Tunisian army, despite the fact that until now it had publicly displayed its neutrality. In any revolt, beyond a certain threshold, uncertainty becomes widespread. When all possible solutions have failed, the struggle to seize power intensifies. But the successive actions of the different competitors clouds things even more, until the situation becomes totally unpredictable. The question of the military becomes a central concern, and a swing of certain military factions to one side or the other becomes a possibility. In such a case, those involved may soon be facing the threat of armed confrontation or even civil war.